what? We're not sure.
We have a special.
Okay, let's see if anybody has any questions you'd like to ask before we begin this time. Yes, Brother Jeremy, back to back.
We talked about the parchment that was used during the Old Testament and then later
Right.
parchment, the New Testament. How would those have been different from one another?
Not at all, except for maybe the format of the book. The format of the books changed as time went by, from being a scroll to a codex, but the material was the same. It's like if you take a piece of paper like this, and you take another piece of paper like this, and you take another piece of paper like this. This is called a quire, Q-U-I-R-E, of pages, a stack of pages. If you fold that stack of pages over like this and fold it at the back, okay, you've got one quire of pages. If you do that again and fold another one over, just like this one, stack it on top of this one and sew it together at the back, you've got a multi-quire codex. So in the early New Testament time, second, third, they began to use codices, books in this form, instead of biblions, biblia, scrolls. So they put the parchment in a different format instead of sewing it end to end together. Like see in a scroll, they'd take a sheet of parchment like this, and they would sew it end to end to another sheet like this. And they'd take that one and they'd sew it to that end like this, and then they'd roll it around the scroll. So that was one way of doing parchment. The other way was taking the same sheets of parchment and just making a quire and a codex out of it. The codices, the manuscripts of the New Testament, are called single quire codexes. Those are old ones that before they got to sewing multiple quires together, and then multiple quire codexes or codices. C-O-D-E-X, codex, is the word which means a book form. Like we have, this is a codex form right here. But the scroll form, same material, different form. Jess, you had a question.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit confused about the Aramaic. You said that Daniel and Ezra have the largest portions. Now, if the reason was because people couldn't understand Hebrew, I guess I'm just confused as to why the whole book wasn't written in Aramaic. Is it just like, here's a section of Aramaic, or is it just interspersed throughout it?
No, it's like, for example, if you go to the book of Ezra for a minute, while the temple is being built, if you go down here to, for example, Ezra chapter 4, there are certain of these opposing leaders that are from different nationalities. They write letters, like in chapter 4, verse 8 and 9, you have this letter from this commanding officer to Artaxerxes, and then you have this in verse 11, you have the letter, there. Those letters are in Aramaic. See, that was the language of correspondence between these Persian leaders, Babylonian leaders, whatever. The other part, like earlier in the book of Ezra, where it's just telling you what was going on, that part's in Hebrew. You see what I'm saying? So it's actually, when there's correspondence between people of Babylonian heritage or whatever, those parts are in Aramaic. However, the people themselves have been in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. After the time of the Old Testament, after the time of the captivity, Aramaic became more and more spoken among the people of Palestine, and Hebrew less and less spoken among the people of Palestine. So by the time of Jesus, Aramaic was the common language of Palestine. Maybe that helps a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, you have similar type phenomenon in the book of Daniel, or phenomena in the book of Okay? Anybody else have a question before we go on? That's what we like. Ask them if you got them. Okay, I'm going to see if I can get our PowerPoint back up.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, Brother Dan Keel.
Sometimes I get confused on, because they say Matthew was written originally in the Hebrew and then translated into the Greek because of the audience.
Who's they?
I just heard that.
That's what I thought. The reason that has been said by some people is that those people see that there are what we call Aramaisms in the Greek of Matthew. In other words, in some of the things that Jesus says in the book of Matthew. It's Greek, but it doesn't sound like Greek. The structure of it is Aramaic, which really, I think, makes the point that I was making, that Jesus actually said it in Aramaic, but it was actually written down later in Greek because it was written to a wider audience.
That works.
Okay?
Yep.
Also, you have some of the same type thing in the speeches of the apostles in Acts, like the speeches of Peter in Acts, which indicate that Peter probably originally said those speeches out loud in Aramaic, but they were written down by Luke in Greek for a wider audience to read and understand.
10-4.
10-4. That's good. Anybody else?
Okay, I have a question kind of based on that. I don't know if we'll get to this later or not. I've heard Catholics in Matthew 16 say that there is no Aramaic word to differentiate between Petros and Petra, and so originally we would have had no way to distinguish, and this is just the way the Greeks kind of express themselves.
I'm not sure if that's true or not. I don't have enough knowledge of Aramaic. I know that Peter's name in Aramaic is Kephas. We pronounce it Cephas, Kephas. And that word meant stone or rock. The distinction there in the Greek language has to do with a word that means a great foundation stone and one that seems to mean a pebble, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there's much of an argument to be made there, because clearly the foundation that he was building the church on was the fact that he was the Christ. And the same Peter that statement was made to concludes the Pentecost sermon by saying, "Therefore let all the house of Israel know for sure that God has made this Jesus whom he crucified Lord and Christ." That seemed to be the bottom line of the Pentecost sermon upon which their faith was built. So, I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that question. Okay, anybody else want to ask one that has to do with how we got the Bible? Okay, very good. So, we've been talking about the types of writing materials that were used. We've had clay tablets. What was that oldest form of writing we saw called?
Cruciform?
No, cuneiform. Cruciform means in the form of a cross. Cuneiform is the type of script we were talking about. Okay? So, clay tablets. What were the most of the Old Testament manuscripts? What type of material?
Like a parchment?
Parchment, which is what?
Membrane.
Membrane or animal skin, right? And what was the other type of material that some of the early New Testament manuscripts written in?
Papyrus.
Papyrus. Papyrus. Okay? Now this is one of the famous manuscripts that is in the British Museum of the Hebrew Old Testament. You can't see it very well. It's in codex form. This manuscript, called the British Museum Codex, is a manuscript of the Old Testament dating from about 1000 AD. 1000 AD. So this is an Old Testament manuscript dating from about 1,000 years after Christ, hand-copied, handwritten, in the form of a codex. Okay? Up until the 1940s, our Old Testament was based on manuscripts like this one. We call it a Masoretic manuscript because of the group of scribes that produced it in the medieval years. They were called the Masoretes, Masoretes. The Masoretes were a group of scribes following a particular scribal tradition, which is called the Masorah, M-A-S-O-R-A-H, Masorah. And the Masorah was the tables of statistics and numbers about how many times different words and phrases and letters occurred in the text of different books of the Bible. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. But this manuscript and 3 or 4 other ones were primarily the type of manuscripts that our Old Testament was based on. This is another closer up shot of the same manuscript, I believe. Nice, neat Hebrew script. This is the frontispiece of a very ornate Hebrew manuscript of Genesis. Up in the blue on the left-hand side, it says Bereshith, which means Genesis. And then you have the text of Genesis. Oftentimes on a medieval manuscript like this, they'd put all this very ornate stuff on what's called the frontispiece, the first page of the manuscript. The title would be in great big letters, and there'd be all these curlicues and filigrees and drawing on it and everything. And then the next page would just be regular Hebrew script throughout the rest of the manuscript. This manuscript is another Masoretic manuscript, and I'm pretty sure that this one may be part of a find that was found in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, Egypt, called the Cairo Geniza manuscript. This is a fragment, a page out of a manuscript from the medieval years. But this is another example of the type of thing that our Old Testament text, as we now have it in my Hebrew Bible over here, was based on up until about the 1940s. Now, the Masoretic scribes were medieval scribes who copied the text based on an inherited scribal tradition. Medieval is defined as like 600 AD to 1500 or so. That's just roughly. The medieval years, the Dark Ages, roughly 476 through the 16th century, maybe not quite that long. Probably 476 to the 1200s would be the Dark Ages, but medieval usually describes the Middle Ages, early and late, like that. So these scribes followed a very strict scribal tradition, and this strict scribal tradition about how many times different words and phrases and letters occurred in each Old Testament book, that this tradition was called the Masorah. The Masorah. It helped guide them and keep them accurate in their copies of the text. So to put this succinctly, the Masorah was a long-standing tradition of the Jewish scribes which involved the passing down of a check and balance system, which ensured the accuracy of copying the text. The word for scribe, you need to know this, is sofer, which means a counter. Because part of the function of the scribes was to count the words and phrases and letters in manuscripts to make sure they had the proper number at different places in the copying of the manuscript to ensure that they were accurate. In other words, this Masorah, this scribal tradition, said, I'm just giving you an off-the-cuff type of an example. If you're copying and if you're midway in the book of Genesis, You should have the phrase, the Lord said, this many times. You should have the name of Yahweh this many times. You should have the verb yireh this many times. You should have, you do all these counts. You count all these statistics. You take what you copy and you count. And if you come up with a bad count on anything, you've made a mistake somewhere. See? So you have to go back and correct or start over because you know you've made a mistake in copy. So the Masorah was a system of things that had to be meticulously counted off in order to make sure that the text was being copied accurately. It required them to count the number of times particular words or phrases occurred through certain points in the text to be sure that they were copied in an accurate way. The word sofer in the Old Testament, this is the word for scribe. Sofer, counter, scribe. The Bible says that Ezra was a sofer. He was a scribe. See? And in the New Testament, oftentimes you find the scribes and the Pharisees together. See? The Pharisees were the teachers of the law. The scribes were the copiers of the law that knew the law and knew the statistics behind the copying of the law. And they copied it so many times they were familiar with it. See? These were scribes. Ezra chapter 7, verse 6. This Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a scribe, well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. Ezra 6, verse 10. Ezra had devoted himself to study the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach in Israel its statutes and ordinances. So Ezra was one of these guys, a scribe. But often the scribes were also teachers of the law. Say the scribes and Pharisees. Sofer, scribe, counter. Now this is from the margin probably of a Hebrew manuscript. It's a Jewish rabbi in the medieval ages training some little scribes, boys, in their Hebrew. And he's not putting up with any static from them. He's running them through their drills. He is running them through their memorization. These boys not only had to memorize Scripture, they had to memorize the Masorah, the Scripture traditions about how many times words and phrases occurred. And they had to check themselves all the time in the copying of the law. This is another picture of a medieval Jewish teacher. You see, if you can see on the monitor at the back or front, he's got a little scourge, a little whip in his hand, and he's whooping that little boy. He's making that little boy recite the thing the right way. No, that's wrong. Boom, boom, boom. He's whooping him, scourging him. Now get it right. There was one thing I read not too terribly long back about this little boy that seemed like he was in Syria or one of the Middle Eastern countries. And they were making him memorize the Quran. He was in Quran school every day. And he would recite the Quran. They'd have one surah every day that they'd have to memorize and recite. And if he got to school and he couldn't recite the surah that he was supposed to memorize for the day, they would take canes and they would beat the bottoms of his feet with canes. They would whip the bottoms of his feet in punishment for not memorizing that particular surah for that day. Well, this is a similar mentality that you had going on in the training of these boys that were scribes. They didn't put up with any static out of these boys. If they wanted to be scribes, they hit the bullet and they got put through the paces and they worked on their scriptures and they memorized their scriptures and they memorized the Masorah and they learned how to write their letters and do it properly, and they did their business right. See, they were very strict about this. See, this is the kind of mentality we had in the copying and recopying of Old Testament scripture. It was a very serious thing to them to guard the text of the Old Testament. Now, it's amazing even still that Jesus, at age 12, could go into the temple, and he could actually dialogue intelligently with some of these scribes that knew that Old Testament inside and out, And he could dialogue intelligently with them because nobody's been whooping the bottom of his feet. But he voluntarily had been studying the Word of God, and he knew what was going on pretty well. People said, whoa, where'd this kid come from? He knows what's going on. Now, oftentimes, the Masorah, M-A-S-O-R-A-H, was included in manuscripts of the Bible in the artwork. If you look carefully at this picture, you'll notice the Star of David there. But if you could get up close to it and look with a magnifying glass, you would see that the star is actually made out of Hebrew words and letters. And if you look at the design that's on the outside, that other design is also made up of Hebrew words, so forth. Inside of the design are the statistics that have to do with that part of the manuscript. So the scribal tradition, the Masorah, was copied along with the manuscripts, either in artwork, sometimes, or in the margins of the manuscript, other forms, at other times. This one, you probably got some of the Masorah up at the top there, written in the margin. This is the Leningrad Codex of the Hebrew Bible, dating 1008 A.D., and you've got some little notations in the margins in between the columns. This type of thing is where they made notes of the statistics of the Masorah. You do need to write down, by the way, the Leningrad Codex as one of the main manuscripts of the Old Testament, Masoretic manuscripts. When we say Masoretic manuscripts, we're talking about late medieval manuscripts copied by the Masoretic scribes. Hebrew manuscripts. This one is called the Aleppo Codex. I believe it's a manuscript of the prophets, but it's another famous medieval manuscript of prophets, and there you can see in the margin some of the Masoretic statistics written. This is also the frontispiece of the book. This is another example of some of the artwork that you sometimes see on the margins of some of these Hebrew manuscripts. You see those little doggies there and the stuff, the designs? The bodies of those doggies, if you look carefully, are made up of Hebrew words. See, the outline of that doggie is a bunch of Hebrew words. The statistics of the Masorah are in the outline of the puppy dogs. And they did this with all kinds of different artwork. So they not only copied the text of the Bible, but they copied the check and balance statistics that checked them on their accuracy of the Bible along with the text of the Bible. How many times is this phrase supposed to be in the book of Exodus? How many times does it say this in the book of Exodus? How many of these verbs do we have in the book of Exodus? That thing. So you get a copy, you'd count, make sure all the counts were right. If count wasn't right, you'd go back and you'd have to fix whatever wasn't right. See? Or you'd have a defective copy. There's another example of one of the Masoretic manuscripts, the neat columns of Hebrew that you found in the medieval manuscripts. Now, in 1898, I believe it was, there was a guy by the name of Solomon Schechter. Solomon Schechter, S-C-H-E-C-H-T-E-R, I think, Schechter. And Solomon Schechter was in Cairo, Egypt, and he was rooting around in the synagogue of Ben Ezra in Cairo, Egypt, which is a very old Jewish synagogue. And in that old synagogue, upstairs in the balcony, there was basically a hole in the wall. And in that hole in the wall, there was kind of a secret room inside that wall. And the secret room was called a geniza. Geniza means a hiding place. A hiding place. It was actually a holy trash can. And that holy trash can had for centuries been the trash can for old Bibles like this one. Man, I can't use that thing anymore. Throw it in the trash can. And so old Bible manuscripts for centuries had been chunked into the geniza, the trash can for Holy Scripture, see, and hidden back there. And Schechter discovered around 22,000 fragments of manuscripts from the medieval years that were stuck back in this geniza, the trash room for old Bibles. The Bible graveyard, you might say.
Did you say 22,000?
Yes, 22,000 fragments of manuscripts. Now, see, we had all these, previously we had these manuscripts like the Aleppo Codex and the Reuchlin Codex of the Prophets and the Leningrad Codex, and these were like dating from 1000 and from 1100 AD, and in that neighborhood, maybe one of them from 9 something or other, but pretty much in that category. Now we've got this big chunk of fragments from the medieval years of manuscripts, most of them still dating in the late medieval years, though. See, but he's finding these in 1898, and some of them have been hiding in there for many centuries in this Cairo Geniza. So he goes back to, I think it was Cambridge University, and he roots through all these things, and see, that's the Cairo Geniza fragments there, and him trying to study these different fragments and compare them to the manuscripts that we had. And this expanded somewhat our knowledge of the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. So we had the Masoretic manuscripts like the Leningrad Codex and the Reuchlin Codex and the Aleppo Codex, a handful of those. And then we had the Cairo Geniza fragments, which were basically the same text as the Masoretic manuscripts, see. All of this gave scholars a pretty good feel that, yeah, these scribes were really, really working on accuracy. They really checked themselves. They really did a good job of consistently copying this. The problem with all of these manuscripts was they were so late in date. None of these, including the Cairo Geniza fragments, dated very early. This manuscript is one of the fragments from the Cairo Geniza, 10th to the 12th century. Yeah, but, okay, so right now, what is it, 21st century? So let's say it's 1,100 years old. But Moses wrote the Pentateuch 3,400 years ago, 3,500 years ago. So that leaves about 2,000 years in time where we don't have anything. So what happened in that first 2,000 years? See, that's kind of where we were scientifically at this point in the 1940s. There's another example of a typical Masoretic manuscript from the medieval times with Masorah written in the margins. There's another one. This is the type of thing that looks like the text of a printed Hebrew Bible almost, very meticulously handwritten. There's another one from the medieval times. You see the Masorah written in the little margins up top and around the sides and everything. There's another real ornate medieval manuscript of the Bible. I think this may be what's called the Lisbon Bible. It's a later medieval Hebrew Bible manuscript. But in 1947, at a place called Qumran, Qumran. At the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, some shepherd boys chasing their goats found some old jars in some caves. And those old jars were full of old Bibles, old manuscripts, and other books of a library that came from an actual community of Essene Jews that lived at a place called Qumran there on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. Since that time, Qumran has been big news in the study of the Old Testament. We have discovered that there was a community there in the 1st century BC and in the 1st century AD. This community of Essene Jews kind of withdrew from society. It was sort of like a Jewish monastery almost. People that had their own little commune going out there. They were very serious about the Old Testament scriptures and the prophecies and all this kind of stuff. They believed that there was kind of a war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. They believed that a figure was going to come in the future called the teacher of righteousness, and that the teacher of righteousness would reveal to them the hidden spiritual meaning of the Old Testament. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because that's exactly what Jesus did when he showed up. You know, he revealed to them the hidden spiritual meaning of the Old Testament. There are actually immersion pools at Qumran where they immerse themselves for purification purposes. Also, it appears that they practiced immersion there as an initiation into the community, which makes us think about people like John the Baptist and stuff. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran Scrolls, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, included not only documents that were Bible manuscripts, but also the documents of that community, their own writings, their beliefs about the Old Testament, the commentaries they wrote on Old Testament books, etc. A lot of these things can be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's not just Bible manuscripts that were in this library, but other things as well. So in the 1st century BC, maybe even further back, and the 1st century AD, this community of people lived here. In AD 68, that is when the Roman army under Titus was coming through Palestine on its way to destroy Jerusalem, this group of people fled, knowing that the Roman army was coming and that it was going to be D-Day for them. They fled. And when they fled this community and deserted it, they stuck their library, they hid their library in the caves, in these jars. And they left. And those scrolls stayed hidden in those caves for the next 1,500 years. No, more than that. 1,900 years. And not until those shepherd boys got to hunting their goats around there did they find those. And the world became aware of what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were 11 of these caves at Qumran that contained these earthenware jars, big old humongous, not little bitty jars, great big jars, with manuscripts stuck down inside of them to keep them dry and keep them in these caves. So there was 11 of these caves where manuscripts were found and collated. They were cataloged and listed by their type and their contents, and etc. This is an example of the kind of big old jars that were there, and this is a fragment of a scroll, a Dead Sea Scroll that was found there, and you have the clues of these things. Now, these things, the thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls was, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually dated as far back as 250 BC. See? So now, all of a sudden, see, our knowledge of the Hebrew text had been like 1000 AD. Now, all of a sudden, we've got Hebrew manuscripts going back as far as 250 BC, over 1,000 years older than our oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible have been before. Now we could really do some checking and see if this Masoretic thing was really working or not, and how accurate we thought the Old Testament really was. There's some other pieced back together jars from the Qumran caves. Show you what these things were like that they found the manuscripts in, all in these caves. This is a Middle Eastern scholar pointing out part of the text of one of the scrolls. This is interesting because, first of all, if you look at that manuscript there, you see the seam there where it's sewed together? The parchment is sewed together? All right? The Hebrew on that is very different. You remember well, let me flip back a few just to show you the difference here. Well, in that one or that one or that one. See those neat columns and those squared off words, how those are in those late medieval manuscripts? Those are the Masoretic manuscripts. See, it looks very, very different than what we're going to see here in just a minute. See those columns there? That's a Masoretic manuscript. The Cairo-Geniza manuscripts even were the same sort of thing. The neat columns. See, that's a Geniza manuscript. Same kind of neat columns. But when you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, if I can get back there. When you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see that the Hebrew is written in wide swaths all the way across the page. And it's not that blocky kind of printed Hebrew. It's more of a scrawled Hebrew, and it's hanging below the lines. It's very different. This Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls is called Paleo Hebrew. Paleo Hebrew. It's an older version of Hebrew. It's an older form of the writing of Hebrew. The letters are actually made in a more ancient way than the letters in Masoretic text. And people that study these manuscripts and then look at a printed Hebrew Bible, the letters are very different. Just like the letters in early Greek manuscripts evolved and became very different the way they looked in the later Greek manuscripts. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were not only an older stage of the Hebrew language, but they took the text of the Hebrew Bible back over another 1,000 years for comparison purposes. Excuse me. This is the entrance to one of the caves. And of course, since all the interest has been there, the Israeli government has gone in there and maybe fixed up the floors and made it easier for people to go inside and so forth. But this is the entrance of one of the caves at Qumran. This is the entrance to cave number 11. Like I said, there were 11 different caves in which manuscripts were stored and found, and they've been taken out and unrolled and photographed and categorized and studied, etc. This is an example of just the contents of cave number 4. Now see, you had 11 of these caves. And cave number 4, for example, there were 11 manuscripts of Genesis in that one cave. There were 11 different manuscripts of Exodus. Now remember, Brother Dan Keel, that at that day and time, it was not just a book like this with all the books in it. It's each individual scroll, like a scroll of Genesis, maybe you had a pile of scrolls of Genesis, and then a pile of scrolls of Exodus. So they're separate. And this is the way they were, and they were the scrolls in the box, but they were all separate. See? So, when you're studying manuscripts from Qumran, or when you're reading about them, let me show you here just a minute. We'll have to turn our Elmo back on. Okay. Now we're talking about these manuscripts from Genesis here. Go zero in here on that upsilon there. Nice upsilon. Okay. Now, let's say we're talking about cave number 4 on our overhead. So if you read something like this that says 4Q Genesis A. All right, what that means is cave number 4 at Qumran, it was a manuscript of the book of Genesis, and it's the first manuscript of Genesis catalog, so it's designated manuscript A. Now see, there were 11 Genesis manuscripts. So the next one would be 4Q Genesis B. See what I'm saying? Cave number 4, Q for Qumran. It was a manuscript of Genesis, and it was the second manuscript cataloged of Genesis. Then you'd have 4Q Genesis C and 4Q Genesis D, and on the way down the line there. See what I'm saying? You with me? So what does this mean right here? If I said 1Q, what does that mean?
First cave.
Yeah, first cave at Qumran, manuscript of Isaiah, and it's the first manuscript catalog of Isaiah in cave number 1. See? So that's the way you reference manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that will come back to haunt you at a later time, what those things mean. So when you're reading along and you see something like that and something you've read, you say, oh yeah, I know what that is. Okay? All right, so in that one cave, you've got 11 manuscripts of Exodus, 4 of Leviticus, 2 of Numbers, 18 of Deuteronomy, 2 Joshua's, 2 Judges, 3 Samuel's, 1 Kings, 15 Isaiah's, 3 Jeremiah's, 3 Ezekiel's, 7 minor prophets, 7 manuscripts of 17 of the Psalms, 3 Job's, 2 Proverbs, 2 Ruth's, 3 Song of Songs, 2 manuscripts of Ecclesiastes, 1 Lamentations, 5 Daniel, 1 Ezra, and 1 Chronicles. Now that's just one cave, and then you go into the next cave, and there's a whole bunch more of them, you know. So this is kind of the way they found these things. It blew everybody's minds that now all of a sudden we have this much evidence from 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years in some cases, earlier than the evidence that we had before. This is the kind of thing you see under glass that preserves large portions of the text of the Old Testament. These are the forms of the Qumran manuscripts. They look much older, they look much different than the very beautiful, professionally produced, ornate manuscripts of the medieval period, the Masoretic manuscripts. All right? The most famous scroll of the Qumran scrolls, which really was a great tool for study, is 1Q Isaiah A. This is 1Q Isaiah A, the Isaiah scroll. It is a complete scroll. See, that's unheard of in these old manuscripts. So many years have gone by, they're so fragmentary, they're so crumbly, but this is a complete scroll of the book of Isaiah. which totally blew scholars away, because when they compared the Isaiahs that they had in the Masoretic manuscripts and looked at this Isaiah, they were virtually identical. And so they said it's uncanny, the accuracy with which these scribes transmitted this stuff over 1,000 years. So the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls have proved the uncanny, meticulous accuracy of the scribal tradition in copying manuscripts. This is one of the primary reasons that we truly believe we have accurate copies of the Old Testament text, because not only do we have the Masoretic text, beautiful professional manuscripts, but we also now have the Dead Sea Scrolls to compare those with. And when you read a modern Hebrew Bible, this is where the modern Hebrew Bible comes from. See, you don't just wake up one day and here's the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is the product of what's written on these manuscripts. So this is the nice pointed Hebrew that we have in our Hebrew Bibles today. Now when I say pointed, you see all these little things like under here, these little dashes and dots and everything underneath the letters. Those are called vowel pointings. In Hebrew, there are no A's, E's, I's, O's, and U's. There are no vowels. These letters up here are only consonants. They're only consonants. The vowel pointings down here do not exist in the old manuscripts like Qumran. The vowel pointings tell you how to pronounce it. See? This pronunciation was passed down in tradition. The Hebrew language only has consonants, no vowels. But they did make vowel sounds, and these tell you how to pronounce them down here. So the modern Hebrew Bible has the pointings that we get from the time of the Masoretes and later, and then down in the bottom, just like in the Greek New Testament, you have the textual apparatus that tells you about manuscripts, and if there is a variant reading in some manuscript, it tells you about those manuscripts, see? But we get this text from collating all those Hebrew manuscripts and saying, based on all the evidence we've got, this is what should be going on. All right, like right, where was that I saw that in? Right there. You know what that word right there is? That's the word Joseph. That's Joseph's name right there. Duh. You could have fooled me, but that's what that is. Okay. Joseph. All right, so the Isaiah scroll and others like it were very, very important in the confirming of the accuracy of the Hebrew text. So when we read the book of Isaiah today, see, or when we read that, for example, you know, in Luke 4, verse 16, the synagogue attendant at Nazareth hands Jesus the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he opens it to the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the poor," etc. Well, that's Isaiah. What we know is Isaiah 61. But Jesus was reading that out of a Hebrew manuscript, sort of like 1Q Isaiah A, you know, back there. When the Ethiopian eunuch was in his chariot reading the prophet Isaiah, you know, he was reading a manuscript, something like 1Q Isaiah A when he was reading. But based on those kinds of manuscripts, that's where we get our translation of Isaiah that we read, like in Isaiah 53, where he grew up before him as a tender plant, as a root out of the dry ground, etc. You know, that's our Isaiah. Okay? Now, not only were there Hebrew Bibles that we have found, not only do you have the Masoretic manuscripts, the great manuscripts of the late medieval time, like the Leningrad Codex, the Rutland Codex, the British Museum Oriental. I've got several of them listed there in my little booklet, those Masoretic manuscripts. But then we had the Dead Sea Scrolls, see, and the Cairo-Geniza fragments. All of that is evidence for the Old Testament in the original language, Hebrew. But there are also versions of the Old Testament. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see the Syriac version of the Old Testament. And so there were numerous versions in ancient times, translations of the Hebrew into other languages like Syriac. Then you have the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, that we have some manuscripts go way back, some of them not so far back, but a lot of manuscripts of the Greek Old Testament. So not only do we have Hebrew manuscripts, but we've got Syriac manuscripts, Greek manuscripts, other languages of the ancient times. We have manuscripts of the Old Testament as well. Manuscript still meaning handwritten copies of translations or in the original language. So there's lots of evidence for the text of the Old Testament. What does version mean, Mr. Rocha?
Version is a translation from the original text
into a different language. That's right. Okay, so that is basically the story of the text of the Old Testament, the transmission of the text of the Old Testament. So what are we basing really our faith in the accuracy of the Old Testament on? Well, we're basing it on the comparison between the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're basing it on the Masorah and the meticulous accuracy of the scribes in copying based on the statistics of the Masorah. Those are the kinds of things that give us faith that we have a very accurate Old Testament text. If I were to ask you to name some of the specific things that we have as evidence for the Old Testament text, you would name some of the Masoretic manuscripts. You would name the Cairo-Geniza fragments. You would name the Dead Sea Scrolls. See, those are primary evidences of the Old Testament. Then you've got the different ancient versions. You've got a Latin version. You've got the Greek version. You've got the Syriac version. Then you would also name, and I didn't mention this, but I should, it's called the Aramaic Targums. Aramaic Targums. Targums. These were like paraphrases of the Old Testament into Aramaic. Explanations of the Old Testament to the people who stopped being able to read Hebrew or speak Hebrew very well, and they had to be explained what it meant. Now, the Pharisees and the scribes continued to transmit the Hebrew and teach how to read Hebrew, and they could read the Bible. People that read the Bible in the synagogue read Hebrew, But in many cases, the people sitting out in the audience in the synagogue really didn't understand it. One time when I was in Memphis in graduate school, I had my Hebrew Bible out. It was probably during the time when Jack Lewis was putting us through Hebrew readings, and I think we were reading First Chronicles or Second Chronicles or something like that in Hebrew. But anyway, I had my Hebrew Bible open, and I was reading it, and this doctor came in. And this doctor said, "Oh, I said, you read Hebrew?" And I said, "Yeah, well, do you?" And he said, "Yeah." And he started pronouncing some of it that I was, and he was, pronouncing it real well. And I said, "Wow." I said, "What does it say there?" And he said, "Well, I don't have any idea what it means. I don't have a clue what it means. They just taught us how to pronounce it." And that was the case with a lot of people, is they could say it, but they didn't know what it meant. See, they could pronounce it, but they didn't know what it meant. And, of course, Jesus wasn't in that category, and neither was Paul, and neither were other people like that. Okay. Anybody want to ask a question about some of those things? Dead Sea Scrolls, any of that stuff?
You spell Aramaic tar, whatever you call that, targums or whatever it was.
Targums. Those are like paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible in Aramaic.
All right, thank you.
Hey, Dan.
Yes, sir.
You said that the Dead Sea Scrolls kind of confirmed the accuracy of the Masoretic text, and they were almost identical. When I read through my Archer book, he talks about a lot of stuff I don't really understand, but I know he said something like older doesn't always mean better, and there are some deficiencies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I really have no idea what he's talking about.
Well, what he's talking about is some books, like, for example, the book of Samuel, have a little more variation in them than the book of Isaiah does, and you have to compare a lot of manuscripts to ferret out kind of what the reading should be. Also, sometimes we have Septuagint manuscripts. For example, let's say we have a Greek manuscript of the book of Samuel from like the 2nd century A.D., okay? Okay, it's in Greek, it's not in Hebrew, but it's a translation of the Hebrew manuscript from the 2nd century A.D. See what I'm saying? All right, then you've got a Masoretic manuscript up here at 1000 A.D. And you've also got Hebrew manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the same time period. Well, remember, when was the Septuagint first translated? Do you remember? Did we deal with that or not?
Was it
We have to
200
deal with that, haven't we? Okay.
Let's talk about what it originally was.
Yeah.
The law.
Okay, it was originally the law. That's right. The Septuagint was first translated. The first translation of the Old Testament into Greek was done about 250 B.C. for Ptolemy, Ptolemy, Ptolemy Philadelphus of Alexandria, Egypt. He had this great big library, and they translated the law. Now, in the intervening years, they translated other parts of the Old Testament. We have some Septuagint manuscripts that go way back. So those Septuagint manuscripts, even though they are translations, represent a form of the Hebrew text that is very old. See what I'm saying? So you compare the Dead Sea Scrolls, you compare the Septuagint, old Septuagint manuscripts, you compare the Masoretic text, and it's really quite scientific, but you come out with what seems to be the most accurate reading. There are a few places where there's a little bit of question, but not as much that would cause any difficulty in understanding the message of the Bible or the Old Testament or whatever. So, yeah, there are a few variations in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but by and large, it was a huge confirmation of the accuracy of the Masoretic text. Yes, Brother Wayne?
Seems like I've heard that the discrepancies were mostly about numbers, not the words.
Sometimes the numbers, true, but we're going to get into variant readings and talk about variant readings, and when we do that, you'll understand this stuff a whole lot better. Okay, y'all have a great day, and I'll see you, Lord willing, on Thursday.
Thanks, Dan.